Welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology 2 and the fifth installment of our discussion of the respiratory system. Last time we talked about the exchange of gases and the transport of gases in the blood and delivered to the tissues and carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs. This time we're going to be talking about the buffering capacity of the blood, and then we'll go on and talk about the regulation of ventilation. What is it that determines how frequently and deeply we breathe? How does the body know what to do in that regard? So, we have actually already talked about the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system. If excess hydrogen ions are produced, and that's typically the occasion on a given day, there's hydrogen ions produced by cellular respiration, by digestion of certain elements of the diet, phosphorylated proteins, for example, lactic acid may be produced. Those extra hydrogen ions will be buffered by combining with bicarbonate ion to produce carbonic acid, and then carbonic anhydrase in the red blood cells can dissociate or split that, I should say, carbonic acid into CO2 and water. We can blow off that CO2 in the lungs. There's 24 millimolar bicarbonate in the plasma. That's a goodly amount of bicarbonate, so that's what's called as the alkaline reserve. We have plenty of bicarbonate there to deal with the typical amount of hydrogen ions produced during a given day. But there could be occasions when hydrogen ion concentration goes down and the blood pH begins to rise, in alkalosis, in which case carbonic acid will dissociate into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions and prevent a big change in pH from taking place in the short term. The next thing that may happen when pH changes is a change in ventilation. Ventilation and the partial pressure of CO2 affects the pH of the blood. Decreasing ventilation increases blood CO2, partial pressure of CO2, and then that causes a drop in pH, right? So if we have these familiar reactions, we build up the reactants on this side, on the left side of the equation. That's going to push the reactions to the right, and we're going to produce carbonic acid by again, the action of carbonic anhydrase, and that's going to dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So that will acidify the blood. Increasing ventilation will decrease the partial pressure of CO2. We're going to blow off more CO2 in the lungs, and that's going to cause the pH to rise because we're taking away CO2 from this side of the reactions, and that tends to draw them to the left. And so now we're going to consume some hydrogen ions, combining them with bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, which again will be split to produce CO2. So that's the relationship between ventilation and partial pressure of CO2, and between partial pressure of CO2 and blood pH. So what about the control of ventilation? The structures we're going to be talking about that are involved in the regulation of ventilation include the respiratory centers in the brainstem. There are respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata as well as in the pons. There are chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata. They're called the central chemoreceptors. There are also chemoreceptors that we've already talked about. They're called peripheral chemoreceptors. They're the carotid bodies and aortic bodies that we've mentioned before. And there are higher brain centers that can affect ventilation, as well as a couple of reflexes we'll talk about at the end. So just a brief rundown of the brainstem and pontine respiratory centers. We won't say too much about them because they're really not very well understood, and so we have enough on our plate to study in this curriculum. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time trying to hash over these poorly understood situations or centers, but let's just quickly look. The ventral respiratory group, the group of cells within the medulla oblongata, is thought to generate the basic rhythm. Initiate each breath, and that creates a rhythm or a frequency of breathing. And as inspiration increases, other neurons get involved in kind of inhibiting that signal, and then eventually the inspiration event ceases, and there's a resting period, and then we start the next breath. The dorsal respiratory group it has influence over the ventral respiratory group in some relatively poorly understood way. Signals come in from the periphery and are integrated in the dorsal respiratory group, and they may modify the effects of the ventral respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group also has some neurons that are thought to increase the vigor of muscle contraction and also bring in some additional muscle groups during exercise to produce a more vigorous inspiration so that we get a larger breath. That's called hyperpnea. The pontine centers are thought to smooth transitions between inspiration and expiration, and between expiration and inspiration, and they modify the VRG, that basic rhythm generator, under unusual conditions like making sounds of speech during sleep, during exercise. So, a modifying center. If the pontine respiratory centers are damaged, there's some very ragged, unusual breathing patterns that emerge. Okay, so that's the brainstem centers, and here they're depicted in this cartoon. You can see the pons. You can recognize it by that big bulge within the brainstem. You can see the fourth ventricle and so forth. Here you can see the medulla oblongata and the VRG and the DRG, and they're wired to the muscles of respiration or ventilation. So, what is the regulation of ventilation? I want you to think about three mechanisms primarily that affect ventilation, and the first one is by far the most important. So the primary mechanism for regulating ventilation is such that the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood will always be 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure. That's the primary variable that's controlled to regulate ventilation. If it changes from that level, ventilation will be modified to adjust it. It's a negative feedback system. However, if the pH of the blood begins to decrease, that will impact ventilation even if PCO2 is right at 40 millimeters of mercury where it's supposed to be. So that's another thing that can impact ventilation we'll talk about. And finally, in emergency situations, if the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood falls dramatically, falls say below 60 millimeters of mercury, then it's going to become the regulated variable. We're going to stop paying attention to PCO2 and start regulating according to the partial pressure of oxygen, drive up ventilation to make sure that we don't expire. Okay, so that main mechanism, ventilation such that partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood is 40 millimeters of mercury partial. So how's that done? If the blood CO2 levels start to rise, this is an example of this negative feedback system, carbon dioxide will start diffusing across the blood-brain barrier, as it avidly does, and there's carbonic anhydrase there in the brainstem, and so that will convert the CO2, combine it with water to produce carbonic acid, which, being a weak acid, will begin to dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, and the central chemoreceptors are actually monitoring hydrogen ion concentration. They're monitoring the pH of the extracellular fluid there in the brainstem. So if CO2 goes up, we have acidification of that fluid, and that will drive up ventilation. Ventilation will increase, and when ventilation goes up, we've said that that makes PCO2 go down. We're going to blow off more carbon dioxide in the lungs, and the pH is going to go back up. And vice versa. If the pH becomes, if the CO2, levels go down, there'll be less CO2 diffusing over into the brainstem. There'll be less hydrogen ions, right? Because we're not going to have as much carbonic acid producing and not going to have as much hydrogen ions liberated. And so that's going to cause a drop in ventilation. That's the main mechanism for control of ventilation at rest during exercise. But there are other instances. So I want you to just think of that as the main mechanism. If you remember nothing else about regulation of ventilation, that's the key. I want to mention one more thing I just realized before I go on. Hydrogen ions do not diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. If the blood pH changes, there are chemoreceptors on the job to monitor that, but the central chemoreceptors will not get wind of that. They respond entirely to indirectly to the CO2 partial pressure because that has to diffuse across the blood-brain barrier, also mean by BBB, and then produce hydrogen ions. Okay, that cartoon is just going to reiterate what we just said. So let's go on a little bit. Here's a beautiful cartoon showing us parts of the brainstem, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and it also shows us the peripheral chemoreceptors, which are going to come into our discussion right now. So here are the carotid bodies, and they're located at the bifurcation of the carotid arteries, the common carotid artery, internal and external carotid arteries, and then the aortic bodies. Around the aortic arch are not only stretch receptors, baroreceptors, but there are chemoreceptors. They're monitoring the pH of the blood and the oxygen tension in the blood. So, if the pH of the blood changes, that will trigger an activation of the peripheral chemoreceptors. So if the blood pH goes down, becomes more acidic, that will stimulate those peripheral chemoreceptors, and that will drive up ventilation. That's going to allow us to blow off more CO2, and that's going to consume some hydrogen ions as we swing those reactions that we looked at a bit ago to the left and consume the hydrogen ions, and the pH will go back up. So even if PCO2 is at 40 millimeters of mercury, if we acidify the blood, ventilation is going to go up. So if we have an acidosis, we have lactic acidosis or ketoacidosis, or for whatever reason the blood pH goes down, that's going to drive up ventilation. That's called hyperventilation. The definition of hyperventilation I want to leave with you is if the partial pressure of CO2 goes below 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure, that's called hyperventilation. I don't want you to think of the colloquial term for hyperventilation. It's not that we're breathing fast or whatever. It's specifically that the PCO2 is less than 40 millimeters of mercury. That's the normal ventilation rate. Now we're talking about an acidification that drives up ventilation, and that's going to cause PCO2 to go down. We are hyperventilating. If you have an alkalosis, let's say you vomit out a lot of hydrogen ions from your digestive tract, and you're left with a lot of bicarbonate ions in the blood. That's the subject of another chapter, digestive system. You will have an alkalosis, and you'll hypoventilate during those conditions. The lungs have a role in controlling the pH in the short term. The kidneys control pH in the long term, but the lungs are called into service to change the ventilation rate and keep the blood pH neutral, even though we're going to get out of whack a little bit with the normal regulation of partial pressure of CO2. Okay, and there's another situation that can affect that normal ventilation control. If oxygen partial pressure falls way down, normally it's 100 millimeters of mercury. Now we're talking about a drop below 60 millimeters of mercury partial pressure. In that case, the peripheral chemoreceptors are going to take over the control of ventilation from the central chemoreceptors who normally are monitoring CO2. It's as though they're saying, look, you guys aren't getting the job done. We got a serious problem here. Partial pressure of oxygen is way too low. We're going to have to take control here. And so they'll drive up ventilation even though CO2 was potentially already being regulated in the normal way, although it might not be. So anyway, that's called hypoxic drive, when the peripheral chemoreceptors take over control of ventilation in response to low oxygen partial pressure. Hypoxic drive. So normally CO2 is monitored. PO2 is not normally monitored in terms of control of ventilation. Now it is. We've got a little shift over of things there. And the kinds of situations when that might happen are going up to high altitude where there's a low amount of low partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. That means there's going to be low alveolar PO2, and therefore there's going to be a low arterial PO2, and we're going to have this hypoxic drive potentially. Lung diseases that influence gas exchange. Emphysema, we've lost a lot of surface area of the respiratory membrane. We also can't get the air out, so we have trouble mechanically ventilating, and so in this case we're hypoventilating badly, and we're going to have hypoxic drive. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to be the regulated variable in emphysema, oxygen. Pneumonia possibly, if you have a lot of edema in the lungs, a lot of fluid in the lungs. Congestive heart failure, a lot of fluid in the lungs, we're going to have hypoxia. Some other centers can control ventilation. The hypothalamus is influenced by the limbic system. If the limbic system gets all riled up and generates an emotional state of anxiety or rage or other very high levels of emotional peak, that's going to change our ventilation by way of the hypothalamus. For example, severe pain may cause us to gasp, or we may hyperventilate when we're very, very agitated by activation by the limbic system. So just some other higher brain centers that can influence ventilation that are not part of the normal regulatory equipment or strategies. The body temperature rises during fever, ventilation goes up, or during exercise. During exercise, one of the things that drives up ventilation rate is increase in body temperature, and that's a normal change in steady state body temperature that occurs during exercise. The more vigorous the exercise and the more high temperature the conditions, the more humid the conditions, the higher the body temperature will be during exercise. Cortical controls, the motor cortex, when we start activating muscles by way of the primary motor cortex, some neurons increase the ventilation at the onset of exercise to help get the ventilation ramped up before we even start getting into a deficit of oxygen as exercise gets underway. So proprioceptors in the joints as well as motor cortex activity can increase ventilation at the onset of exercise. Ultimately, during exercise, ventilation is controlled such that partial pressure of CO2 is kept right at 40 millimeters of mercury. But during that initial phase, it just prevents us from getting too far behind in terms of oxygen debt during the onset of exercise. There are reflexes that can impact ventilation. There are irritant receptors in the airways that will respond to noxious stimuli, and they will cause a halting of inspiration. Right? If something really noxious gets into your airways, that'll stop you from breathing in. You'll probably cough, you'll breathe out. It's a reflexive thing to keep you from inspiring bad stuff like maybe volatile emissions from a fire or strong ammonia or something like that. The lung inflation reflex, Herring-Breuer reflex, what a wonderful name. Let's keep those proper names of historically important figures in our curriculum, please. So Herring-Breuer reflex, there are inflation sensors in your lungs and your chest cavity, so that as you inflate the pulmonary system further and further and further, there's more and more stimulation of these stretch receptors, and they begin to feed in and inhibit the inspiratory signals of the VRG. So it's an emergency kind of thing. I shouldn't use the word emergency, that sounds odd. It's a stopgap to prevent excessive expansion of the lungs, of the thorax. So we're going to inhibit some maximal volume of air inspiration and get us back to expiring so we can take the next breath. So here's a little summary cartoon showing us all the things that we've been talking about. Stretch receptors in the lungs and in the chest wall will begin to inhibit inspiration as they continue to be stimulated. Irritant receptors in the airways can stop an inspiration. During exercise, the onset of exercise, proprioceptors in the joints and muscles will ramp up inspiration, get things going. Likewise, motor cortex activity will also, at the onset of exercise, increase ventilation early on in the exercise bout. But the normal regulation of primary signal for regulation of ventilation is, of course, keeping the PCO2 at 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure. So that's the main mechanism. It's actually mediated largely by the central chemoreceptors in the brainstem. And again, CO2 diffuses across into the extracellular fluid in the brainstem, converted to hydrogen ions, and the chemoreceptors are actually monitoring hydrogen ions. Actually, the peripheral chemoreceptors do have a role in that same process. The peripheral chemoreceptors sense blood pH. If blood pH begins to fall, hydrogen ions are going up. That'll increase ventilation so that we can blow off more CO2 and right the pH again. If there's a large drop in oxygen partial pressure, that will cause the peripheral chemoreceptors to drive up ventilation to make sure that we don't utterly expire from ischemia and hypoxia. During exercise, as we said, ventilation will increase. That increase in depth of breathing, which is largely what happens during exercise, is called hyperpnea. Eupnea is the normal breathing that we do at rest without any irritation or any difficulty. Hyperpnea is that increase in ventilation. So we're still going to be ventilating such that PCO2 is 40 millimeters of mercury, but we're producing a lot more CO2. All those working muscles are metabolizing like crazy, producing a lot more CO2, and therefore you have to ventilate a lot more deeply in order to keep PCO2 at 40 millimeters of mercury. And so PCO2 remains at that value. Oxygen, except in the most extreme cases, partial pressure of oxygen never changes. Alveolar PO2 during exercise remains 104 millimeters of mercury. Arterial PO2 remains 100 millimeters of mercury, and so forth. So there's really no changes in oxygen partial pressure except in the most elite athletes exercising can exercise so vigorously and push themselves to the point where partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood will begin to go down. The pH will indeed go down if we exercise very, very vigorously. If we have anaerobic respiration, we have some very high intensity, short bursts of exercise, we'll have lactic acidosis that will drive up ventilation. But if we're exercising at a modest rate for a long period of time, pH will remain constant. During exercise, we have these brain centers that are driving up ventilation. We have the motor cortex driving up ventilation. We have proprioceptors driving up ventilation. We have psychologically stated activation of ventilation through the limbic system. All those things are driving up ventilation during exercise to some degree. And so it turns out that as we end exercise, all of those things shut off. And so there's a sudden drop in that increased ventilation during exercise that had been going on during exercise. And then there's a gradual decline. Ventilation remains elevated while we still have acid in the blood, while the body temperature is still elevated, and until we get all the systems back to the way they were before exercise. We need to do that's called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption that will continue for a period of time as we convert all the lactic acid back to pyruvic acid and run it through the mitochondria and produce lots and lots of ATPs and so forth. I guess we're going to have a little paragraph down here on the subject of exercise physiology. If we do that high intensity exercise I was mentioning over here, sure, we're going to have lactic acidosis. Why? Because during intense exercise, we start recruiting the fast glycolytic muscle fibers, the so-called type 2 muscle fibers, and their whole mechanism of energy production is anaerobic, and they're going to ferment and produce lots of lactic acid. And that'll drive up ventilation, and it'll stay elevated until we kind of conquer that problem after we go into the resting phase. So there's our same cartoon. I won't go back through and look through that again right now. You can use that as a review tool, though, to make sure you can explain to yourself what are all these references to in terms of the regulation of ventilation, be able to tell the story. How about high altitude? Well, when we go up to high altitude, above 10,000 feet especially, here they're claiming 6,000 or 8,000 feet, that's fine. As we go up to those high altitudes, what happens? We have to switch to hypoxic drive. We have normal regulation of ventilation. PCO2 is wonderfully kept right at 40 millimeters of mercury, and yet partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood is falling below 60 millimeters of mercury. Not cool. So the peripheral chemoreceptors are going to want to take over ventilation, increase ventilation. Hey, there's no problem. So now ventilation goes up, CO2 goes down, partial pressure of oxygen gets normal, and the central chemoreceptors start saying, hey, PCO2 is awfully low. Why are we doing that? Let's take over and go back to regulation of CO2 as we should be, and everything else looks normal to them. The O2 levels have gotten normal, and so we kind of switch back to central control of ventilation by partial pressure of CO2, and then oxygen levels start to fall. So you have this battle kind of between the central and peripheral systems and what variables are going to regulate ventilation, and it causes some discomfort. It's not a pleasant experience. It's actually referred to as altitude sickness or mountain sickness sometimes. Some people actually experience fairly powerful nausea symptoms from this and dizziness. Usually it's a relatively mild thing, but you don't feel so great and you feel very short of breath and very tired. Feel very listless, don't feel like doing much. Eventually, if you stay at high altitude, you will acclimatize or acclimate. Well, those terms are often used interchangeably, even though they're technically not the same thing. But anyway, we're going to acclimatize. We're going to make some long-term adjustments. We're going to agree to do things differently instead of having this battle between the two mechanisms of regulation of ventilation. And ultimately, we're going to decide to essentially hyperventilate all the time. We're going to breathe more deeply and have 2 to 3 liters per minute higher ventilation rates than normal in order to provide the oxygen that's needed in that low oxygen atmosphere. So that's one of the things that happens. Very cool that your body can kind of find a way to make peace and operate normally at under these new conditions of low atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen. Incidentally, we'll also have an increase in erythropoietin released from the kidneys because they're hypoxic, and that's what they do, and that increases the hematocrit. We're going to have a signal going to the red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells more quickly, and the hematocrit is going to rise. We're going to have polycythemia if we stay at high altitude for a long time. We'll have a higher than usual hematocrit, higher than usual fraction of blood volume occupied by red blood cells. Now we've got more oxygen carrying capacity, and that'll help solve our problem of a lower available pressure of oxygen to push into the blood. Okay, a couple more homeostatic imbalances to round things out. COPD is actually a combination of two terrible conditions, one especially terrible one. Emphysema is a degenerative disease in which the alveolar walls are actually degrading, and many alveoli are essentially coalescing into larger and larger alveoli as the surface area of the respiratory membrane is decreased by that degeneration. Additionally, it becomes difficult to expire air from your lungs. Air becomes trapped. The harder you try to breathe out, the more air gets trapped in the lungs, and it's a very panic-inducing situation oftentimes, and you just can't get the air out. You're going to hypoventilate all the time, and you have poor gas exchange. In addition, COPD is associated with chronic bronchitis, chronic inflammation of the lungs, in the absence of any infection to really explain the presence of that inflammation. So we've got this mucus production, we've got bronchoconstriction happening. That also exacerbates the difficulty in ventilating. We've got this problem of edema with air trapping. It's a terrible, terrible situation. That difficulty in breathing, labored breathing, is called dyspnea. So we have eupnea as normal breathing. Hyperpnea is deep breathing during exercise. Dyspnea is difficulty in breathing. And I might as well throw one more out there while we're on the nias. Apnea is cessation of breathing, and you've probably heard of sleep apnea. That comes from the same sort of root, talking about some things related to breathing or ventilation. So anyway, COPD is the endpoint of long-term cigarette smoking. History of cigarette smoking is present in 80% of patients with COPD. Some people are exposed to occupational hazards. Some people are exposed to air pollution. Some people have congenital mutations that make them susceptible to development of emphysema. So anyway, we have hypoventilation, we have respiratory acidosis, and we have hypoxemia. Not enough oxygen in the blood. We can't oxygenate the blood sufficiently. Another problem with emphysema is that not only do we have air trapping and all those problems we just talked about, and hypoxemia, we have vasoconstriction because of autoregulation in the lungs. We know that the lung arterioles respond to low oxygen and high CO2. That's exactly what we have under the conditions of emphysema. Causes vasoconstriction. And normally, it's a mechanism designed to match ventilation and perfusion over different regions or zones of the lungs so we get good oxygenation of the blood. Well, in this case, we're going to vasoconstrict the entire lung because it's all hypoxic in there. And so now the right heart is faced with an extra heavy workload because with all that vasoconstriction, it's going to have to drive up the blood pressure higher than normal to force that full cardiac output through the lungs. And so the right heart eventually, after years and years of hypertension in the pulmonary system, is going to start to die, and we're going to have right heart failure. And we talked about left heart failure quite a bit in the past as a response or a result of systemic hypertension. Well, now we have pulmonary hypertension and right heart failure. You can have chronic bronchitis in the absence of COPD. If you have inhaled irritants, if you have occupational exposure, you're going to have an inflammation in the lungs. Sometimes when people get a bad respiratory infection, they wind up with bronchitis for a long time and just can't settle that inflammation down, and they have this ongoing problem of or bronchoconstriction and mucus production that obstructs airways and makes ventilation difficult. Here's just another thing about different people respond differently and have different clinical presentations with COPD, the so-called pink puffers and blue bloaters. That's sort of a more purely clinical thing if you're interested in kind of digging into that a little bit more. What are we going to do about people that have bronchitis or that have even asthma, inflammation in the respiratory system, and bronchoconstriction and mucus production? We're going to treat them with some inhalers, some aerosolized medications that may help them. One thing we can use is, in less severe situations, we can use a beta-2 agonist like albuterol. It acts like epinephrine. It goes to the beta-2 receptors on the smooth muscle cells in the bronchioles and in the bronchi and causes them to relax. We have bronchodilation. If it's a more severe situation like COPD, we're probably going to use a corticosteroid to knock down that inflammation and help open up the airways and suppress that mucus production and let us get a little bit more air through there. So I'm going to skip over this slide, which is again just a review of things we've been talking about. Asthma, again, as I mentioned, is a irritant response. It could be purely a direct irritant response, or it could actually be there could be a type 1 hypersensitivity involving immunoglobulin type E and anaphylaxis. those two things, asthma or anaphylaxis, can cause bronchoconstriction and dyspnea, difficulty breathing, and we may need to use a beta-2 agonist to help open up those airways and reduce the mucus production so that we can freely breathe again. In worst case scenarios, you may need to use epinephrine. We may have to stab an EpiPen right into a muscle to release some pure epinephrine, which will then be picked up into the blood rapidly, and that'll cause bronchodilation. In certain cases, if we have a severe anaphylaxis or a very severe asthma combination, it might be fatal. Someone may actually suffocate from inability to ventilate when the bronchioles are constricted right down. So we're going to need to really get some bronchodilation happening right now, and that's the purpose of the EpiPen or epinephrine pen. Tuberculosis is a bacterial disease in which bacteria that find their way into the respiratory tract from an exposure to an infected person. Right, we're going to inspire some bacteria in some droplets that came from another person, and those bacteria, when they get down into the alveoli, are gobbled up by macrophages, but unfortunately, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria can survive in a macrophage. All those things that we learned about macrophages can do, respiratory burst and lysosomal fusion and so forth, just can't kill these bacteria, and they multiply right in the macrophages. And then more macrophages are called in, inflammation begins, and we have this battle between multiplying TB bacteria and white blood cells trying to fight them off, and eventually the body just throws up its hands and says, well, I can't conquer this thing, we'll wall it off, and it just tends to form a connective tissue capsule around this little war zone that's taking place that doesn't seem to resolve. And the hallmark of tuberculosis is the appearance in the lungs of an X-ray of these electron-dense spheres or tubercles that shouldn't be present in there, which represent live bacteria trapped inside of these connective tissue structures. Those can remain dormant for years and years and years of time. Well, people with tuberculosis don't know they have tuberculosis oftentimes during those latent periods. And then eventually, for poorly understood reasons, those bacteria may suddenly start to grow like crazy and break down the tissues of those tubercles and break free and cause systemic disease. So eventually tuberculosis is a fatal disease. But the problem is, well, one of the many problems is we're going to possibly infect many, many people in the course of that latent period when those bacteria are essentially kept cordoned off in the tubercles, but not utterly. And so people are carriers and transmitters of disease in the population. That's why in this country, whenever you go to apply for a job, you'll be administered a tuberculosis test. It's a type 4 hypersensitivity test to see if you are positive for tuberculosis. And if so, then you'll be treated with a long course of antibiotics. It takes a long time to kill these things because they're kind of sequestered in those tubercles. A 12-month course of antibiotics, and that's leads to a lot of problems of its own. So interesting situation there. Lung cancer. Cancers can arise from virtually any tissue type. In the lungs, there are 3 predominant types of cancers that arise from different types of tissues of the lungs. We have adenocarcinomas that arise from glands. Adeno means of glands on gland tissue, so an adenocarcinoma might be a type of lung cancer. A squamous cell carcinoma arises from epithelia of the bronchi or bronchioles. And then small cell carcinoma arises from white blood cell, like lymphocyte-like cells in the respiratory system. So these are the types of cancers that may be the victim or be the fate of a person who's a long-term cigarette smoker. Most people that get lung cancer are long-term cigarette smokers. It's critical to detect lung cancer. Here's the problem. It's not usually detected early. Most people don't know they have lung cancer until well into the disease, and it's usually a very serious condition indeed. There are a number of things that can be done to attempt to treat lung cancer, but the prognosis for people that get lung cancer in 5 years is relatively low. I forget the percentage, but you can look that up. It's really usually pretty dire. Unless lung cancer is detected during a normal procedure to evaluate some other situation in the body and lesions are observed in the lungs. In those cases, maybe then we'll get a nice early detection and we can treat that lung cancer before it's out of control. There are some research angles designed to try to help us conquer this problem. It's one of the most lethal cancers and one of the most prevalent cancers. If you look up the the highest incidence of human cancers. Lung cancer will pop up as a very high one, especially after they usually ignore skin cancers, which are by far the most frequent types of human cancers. But lung cancers are right up there, and they're pretty devastating. So that's our story. I'm not going to go into developmental biology. I usually leave that out since that's a whole other specialty unto itself. You can take a whole course in developmental biology, and I urge you to do so since biology is the wonderful thing that it is. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for 5 sessions of respiratory system anatomy and physiology, and I look forward to meeting up with you again for the digestive system. Chapter 23 will take a look at how we digest food and absorb those wonderful nutrients into our bodies that sustain us. So I'll see you next time.